Good morning. My name is Kubash Jagelski, and I'm going to be your lecturer for Advanced Business Economics. So welcome to the course, and I do hope you enjoy it. On the next slide, I will give you some more details about how to contact me and the amount of lectures that we have. So please hold on and welcome again. So this is my full name. As you can see, it's Dr. Kubash Jagelski. My surname is a bit of a mouthful. I do understand, so I'm highlighting it there. Hopefully you don't forget that. Don't worry, many people struggle to pronounce it. You are always welcome to contact me over email. So should you have any questions about the content of the course itself, the content of any of the chapters, or you require further explanations, or any other related questions, I would encourage you just to send me an email on my email address. I do keep a close eye on my email address, so I should be able to respond to you quite quickly. My office is room 216, although currently that is inaccessible given the COVID-19 restrictions that we are experiencing. But hopefully, as things ease up, you are most welcome to come and drop in to see me. The textbook that we are using is called Economics of the Public Sector. It is by Joseph E. Stiglitz and J.K. Rosengard. And you will see it at the bottom of the teaching and learning plans as prescribed content. There should be copies available in the library. And this week, what we'll be covering is chapters 1 and 2. And the first lecture deals with defining public sector responsibilities. So we begin with the role of the public sector. We discuss why does the government get involved in the economy and what are the ideal outcomes the government wishes to achieve. So why is the government a player in the economy? Then we talk about something called normative versus positive economics. Then we go on to a discussion, the third point, that is, what is the role of government? And then we also talk about types of government activities. So what exactly is it that government does? How does it get involved? Not only why it gets involved, but how it gets involved in the economy. So that is the fourth point. Then what we do is we discuss the size of the public sector. And there's often a discussion depending upon which side of the political spectrum you are as to whether government should be big or whether it should be small. In other words, do we want a government that also employs a lot of people, provides employment, or do we want a government that just provides administrative framework? Then we talk about the role of government revenues. Obviously, government needs to spend money, and in order to spend that money, it needs to get money from somewhere. So that is revenue through taxation. And then what we have is deficit financing. So first of all, why do we study economics? That's what we need to begin with. Well, what has to happen is the economists need to answer a number of central questions. And what economists study is essentially scarcity. Now, why are we worried about scarcity? Because resources are scarce. And what we have to do is we have to satisfy unlimited wants using limited resources. Okay, so this is the statement that we are looking at. The idea is to satisfy an unlimited number of wants with limited resources. And the overarching questions then relate, how do we allocate these resources in order to satisfy these unlimited wants? Obviously, we cannot satisfy all these unlimited wants. Therefore, we have to make sure that we allocate those resources as efficiently as possible. And hence, that leads us to four central questions that we are concerned with. So the questions that we ask ourselves are, what is it that is to be produced? How is it to be produced? So the first question is what is to be produced? The second question is, how is it to be produced? Should we produce privately? Should the private sector produce certain goods? Or should certain goods be provided by the public sector? And as you can imagine, the public sector does provide a number of goods, such as health in the United Kingdom, policing. So all of these are goods and services that are provided publicly as opposed to privately. Whereas in some places, you do have the private provision of healthcare and security, such as private security companies. But nevertheless, that is a question. And related to that is, what is it that we produce? How is it that we produce it? We ask ourselves, what sort of resources do we use? Do we use capital? Okay. Or alternatively, do we use a mix of both capital and labor, or do we focus more on using labor to produce specific goods? And then what we also need to be aware of when using capital and labor, or a mix thereof, What is the extent of technology that we use, or what is the reliance on technology that we take in producing these goods that we need to make choices about producing in the first place? So as you can see, the first two questions already indicate or summarize the complexity of this question, of this question of how we use limited resources to produce or meet unlimited wants, societal wants. Of course, once we start producing, we also need to know who is it that we are producing for. And not everyone will benefit equally from the production of a specific good. That's also another thing. So for example, education, some people who do have access to education, whether it be public or private, will benefit from it. And all that is produced, it might not be accessible to others. So that is point number 3 that relates to the use of resources, limited resources, specifically to meet societal wants. Then, how are decisions made? Okay, how do we decide what is it to be produced? So it's not only what is to be produced, how do we produce it in terms of resources, and who are we producing it for? We are also interested in answering questions, how do we make decisions? And the decision process is really guided by prices. So what prices do is they act as a mechanism to indicate what should be produced. So for example, if the price of good A goes up, what does that indicate? That producers should provide more of good A. So that is an indicative mechanism. Obviously, there's a number of other aspects that come into it. There's also collective choice that comes into it. So what is it that matters for society? But from a private individual perspective, what is it that we can purchase and what are we going to spend our money on, because money is limited. The amount of income that we have is limited. So in figure 1.1, we begin with a specific concept, and this is something called society's production possibilities schedule. We could also call it the production possibilities frontier. In other words, given the resources, what is it that we are able to produce? Okay, with the resources that we have, because we have limited resources. So there's certain levels of production that we are able to achieve. And what is the mix that we should be producing at? So if you look at figure 1.1, what you essentially see is you see two goods. You see private goods, and what you see is also public goods. And then you see the frontier, which is this line. And on that line, what we have is we have point G and also point E. Both of these represent specific combinations of private goods and also public goods that we can produce. So if we start at point E, we are producing a certain quality of public goods. Call that P1, and that would correspond to, call that P2. Now what happens is that we can produce either more public goods or we can produce more private goods. But in order to produce more private goods, we have to give up some public goods. If we give up the production of public goods, in other words, we spend less resources on producing public goods and we begin producing more private goods, what happens is that we move along the production possibilities schedule to point G. Okay, note the reason why we have to give up the production of public goods or sacrifice some public goods is because we have unlimited resources. So we have to sacrifice some public goods and shift resources from the production of public goods to the production of private goods. And hence, that is how we are able to achieve point G. So we are able to produce along this frontier or along this schedule at any point, but this requires that we give up the production of one good and by shifting resources from the production of that good to the production of another good. Okay, note, although we are speaking in terms of private goods and public goods, these could be goods, any form of goods. On the y-axis, what you could have is you have could have good A, and on the horizontal axis, you could have good B. Okay, so the idea is very much the same, that in order to produce more of one good, what we have to do is we have to give up some resources that are used, we have to shift resources from the production of another good, which means that we are giving up production of another good in order to increase the production of the other good. Now, what we can also do is we can produce at point I, but we don't want to produce at point I. The reason why is because we can produce more goods. So at point I, we will be producing less private goods and less public goods than we are able to if we utilize our resources efficiently. So we state that point I is an inefficient point. On the other hand, we could also try to produce more public goods and private goods. Then at both points G and E and any point that lies along the schedule, the production possibility schedule. The reason why we can't do that is because we simply don't have resources to produce at point at point N. Therefore, what we say is that point N is infeasible. Okay. So in summary, point I is inefficient. We are not utilizing our resources. Point N is infeasible. We do not have the resources to produce at point N. Points G and E we are able to produce, but we have to shift resources if we want to produce more of one good, meaning that we'll have to produce less of the other good. Now, how do we tie this into decision making of whether we should produce more private goods or more public goods? How do we determine the mix? Well, this is when we have to talk about positive and normative economics, and we have to make use of so-called economics models. So essentially what we have is we have two types of statements. Okay, first of all, we have positive economics, and what positive economics argues about, or what it proposes, is that we are concerned with what currently is. So this is based on empirical data that we have. Okay, so we might say this is the amount of this public good that we are producing. Let's say this is the amount of roads that we are building. But on the other hand, empirical analysis, a model in other words, suggests that we need to have a greater amount of roads. Okay, so hence what we are able to do is we are able to reconcile by using data and looking at what is as to how much we are producing of a specific good and what the demand for that good, what that demand for that good may be or is currently. On the other hand, we have one another form of statement, so-called a normative statement. In other words, normative economics. So the idea here is that we are concerned with what should be, okay, as opposed to what would be under positive economics, where we are concerned with what is. So when we talk about normative economics, we make value judgments as to what should be. So here we might have a number of policies, and what economists will do, or policymakers will do, is they will try to weigh up these policies to see which policies should be implemented. And what will come into this equation is so-called normative judgment, or a judgment call, based on the beliefs as to what the situation should ideally be, as opposed to what it currently is. Okay, so imagine this way. Here's an example. A positive statement or positive economics would say, well, this is the level of income, and this is the level of taxation. What a normative statement or normative economics will look at, well, this is how much we want to increase income by, but because income is increasing, in order to maintain an equal society, this is what we also should do with taxation. So that is what we aspire to, as opposed to what the current situation is. Now, going back to what we started with, the discussion was about the production of private goods and public goods. And when we talk about public goods, we are immediately looking at the role of government in the production of such goods. So we need to discuss what is it that distinguishes a government from private institutions. Okay, so that is the question first, before we proceed. So there are two important differences. First of all, in democracy, government is elected. At least representatives of government are elected, whereas government comprises of a number of spheres. So we are talking about this concept of government quite loosely at this point in time. So what we have is we have a number of individuals who are responsible for running public institutions, and they are elected or appointed by someone that is elected. Now, in contrast, when we look at a private institution, what we have is we have companies where we have shareholders that appoint management who are responsible for administering to those companies. Now, shareholders need to pay in order to become shareholders. So what they do is they purchase fractions of a company, and that is what makes them shareholders. It's unlike government, which is elected where everyone can vote and no money is required for that. On the other hand, when we talk about shareholders, these are people that own fractions of a company, and hence what they do is they appoint those are responsible for administering companies. Also, government has certain rights, okay, certain rights of compulsion that private institutions do not have. Okay, so for example, a company cannot make you pay tax, whereas government can make you pay tax. A government can force you to do certain things. So that is what a right of compulsion is, that the government can make you do certain things. Okay, taxes are obviously the most notable, as are most visible and most keenly felt, but other things that the government can do is obviously try you and also put you in jail, something that private company cannot do. So hence governments can do something against your will. So what is it that government does? First of all, it produces goods and services. Okay, so for example, governments produce security, or maybe not produce security, but provide the infrastructure for security by paying the police. So they provide a service, they provide roads, they provide other forms of infrastructure, they provide courts, they provide justice, they provide defense. So all of these can be seen as both in goods and services provided by the government. So these are public goods, everyone benefits from them. Ideally should at least benefit from them. So that is what government does. It produces goods and services that the public should benefit from. Okay? Obviously, these goods and services are a little bit different from those produced by private enterprise, where only individuals that specifically pay for those goods and services benefit. On the other hand, the public benefits from most goods and services produced by the government, such as policing, roads, pavements, infrastructure, and so on. Also, what the government does, it regulates and subsidizes and taxes private production, so it taxes income, and that's how it raises its revenues, so that's point 2. It also purchases goods and services from private enterprise and also from individuals. Okay, so some goods and services that are provided by government are purchased from private individuals or private institutions. So for example, the example of national defense, okay, the equipment that is used in defense is produced by private firms, but government purchases that equipment. It also pays for the time of those that work in the army. Okay, so that is point 3. It is also interested, or what the government does is it also tries to redistribute income. So everyone pays taxes, and then what happens is that government spends those taxes where they are needed. So for example, it will uplift areas that are deprived. So that is a form of redistribution. We'll use that income to help those that are in need of economic and social help. So that is a form of the redistribution of income and also the upliftment of society by redistributing income. So that is point 4. So how is it that we measure the size of government? Okay, well, the size of government is obviously related to the production of goods and services by government, specifically the production of public goods, and that's what we're concerned with in this lecture. Well, what we have to look at is we have to look at the employment by government. Okay, so for example, here what we see is, remember, this is an American textbook, so we are essentially using American data. But the point is very much the same. Here what we see is we see a spike in total government employment as a percentage of employment. In other words, a greater fraction of the population during World War II was employed by government in the United States. And why is that? Well, because of the war effort. So government at that point in time was rather big. And what would happen is that in this instance, people were working to provide armaments for the war effort. They were working in the army. They were also working other related services. So hence, obviously, because this was a big event in history in general, what happened is that government was employing many people in the workforce. And hence, that is why we see that spike. So hence, at that point in time, we can say that government was big. Government was of a big size. And essentially what happens is that over time, we have changes in the size of government. Okay? Unless there is an exceptional event such as World War II, the size of government is dependent upon the type of ideology that prevails in government. So for example, leftist governments tend to be of a big size. They tend to also function as Employers, they want to provide jobs in the public sector, and hence what they do is they employ a lot of employees. Obviously, this has a problem. This is a problem because this means that there is a drain on revenue, government revenue. On the other hand, conservative governments are of the belief that government should be of a small size. It should be employing not a lot of people. And instead, what should happen is that a lot of services that were previously provided government should be outsourced to the private sector. But in summation, that is essentially what we talk when we talk about the size of government. What is the, or how many, or what is the fraction of the total workforce that is employed by government at a point in time? And that changes according to specific events or alternatively due to government ideology. So what else is it that government does? Well, government has a central function, we've already touched on that, and that is the redistribution of income. Essentially, this is taking taxes, which are paid by the entire population, and reallocating those funds to areas and people where money is required. So what is the form of these programs of this relocation? Well, first of all, at point number one, we have public assistance programs. So benefits are provided to those that are poor and in need. So for example, the dole or an unemployment benefit. So this is money taken from the fiscus and then goes to people that need some kind of aid. Okay, so money that is paid by everyone, reallocated to those that require it. Then we also have so-called social insurance. So these are benefits that are provided to the retired, disabled, unemployed, and sick. Again, those that might no longer be currently working or are no longer working. And again, the reason why this is redistribution is because it's coming from the fiscus, and in other words, it's coming from tax revenues, and everyone is paying taxes. So the many support the few through redistribution, or assist the few through redistribution. So, for example, in the United States, we have a temporary assistance to needy families. So if a family is struggling, they can receive this benefit. We can also have aid to families with dependent children. So families that might be struggling to raise children, or children require special care, are given an aid. Or given funds by the federal government in the United States. And then also what we have is a supplementary security income. In other words, some lump sum of money or some amount of money that goes to assist those that might not have an income that allows them to achieve a specific quality of life. Also, what we have is in-kind benefits. So these are funds that are provided to pay for specific types of costs, such as medical bills. So these might indeed relate to a lump sum of money that is given to a family, and then the family can spend it, or someone, or just individual, and that individual family can spend that money, that lump sum of money, as they see fit. On the other hand, in-kind benefits are ring-fenced to pay for a specific type of expenditure, such as medical aid or medical cover, medical bills in other words. So let's talk about social insurance programs a little bit more. Well, social insurance works that it is a form of insurance, but it's insurance administered by government. So an example would be unemployment benefits. So what happens is that a little bit of my salary is taxed for the purposes of insuring me in case I become unemployed. So when I become unemployed, what happens is that I receive a benefit. And that benefit obviously comprises what I had paid in, but also what the government might do is it might top it up from general tax revenue. So I get a little bit more. So there's essentially two components. There's my individual entitlement, which is based upon my contribution, but that contribution is only partly responsible, or partly leads to what I receive when I am, for example, unemployed. Okay, so for example, what will happen is, yes, I will receive my insurance premiums, but those will be topped up. But what comes from government revenues? So that is how government will redistribute income from those that have paid to those that require it. Other examples are old age, survivors and disability insurance programs. So again, in this instance, we have individuals paying in some kind of insurance against, well, you can't insure against old age, but you can insure against not having money in old age by paying premiums. Same thing for disability. You pay some form of insurance. And if it happens that you become disabled, let's say, what happens is you receive those premiums plus you also receive a portion of taxpayers' money, or what comes from taxpayers' money. So that is the top up. That's where the redistributive aspect comes in. Now, how does government spend its money? So this is the next point that we need to discuss. Well, first of all, what the government does is it undertakes transfer payments. So this is where we have aid. That's what we could call aid, transfer payments, right? So 43.3% of government's budget goes to essentially supporting people that need support. Note the definition of transfers within the economic census. So what a government does, it makes transfer payments. The definition of a transfer payment is that no goods or service is rendered for that payment. Okay, so that is how we distinguish transfer payments from so-called purchases. So what government also does, it purchases certain goods or services. So as mentioned in the previous slides before, it pays for the time of those people that work in the armed forces, or it pays for the time for those people that work in the police. In other words, a service is rendered, and that service is policing, or that is defense. Also, it spends money on physical goods, such as, let's say, military hardware. So that is what also then goes to defense. The difference between these purchases and transfers is that for purchases, goods and services are rendered, unlike transfer payments, where no goods and services are rendered. With transfers, what government is doing is it's transferring funds to certain groups or certain individuals, and there's no service rendered for that. With purchases, goods and services are provided for monies paid by government. What government also does is it spends money on subsidies. So for example, when farmers produce, in order to encourage and make farmers locally more competitive, because then they can sell for lower prices, what government does is it offers subsidies. So for example, farmers are told for every basket of eggs that you do sell, and let's say you are selling it for £100, right? You want to charge £100. Well, you can go ahead and you can charge £90. And what we will do is we will top that up with £10. So that is what a subsidy is. It's adding on, or at least reducing the cost and also the price at which farmers would sell it in order to make it easier for them to sell. Okay, it's paying them to produce. So that is what a subsidy is. Then finally, what a government also does is it finances expenditure by borrowing money from the public and also borrowing money from international markets. Now, obviously, when you borrow, what has to happen is that you have to pay that money back. So you have to pay the principal, and also what you have to do is you have to pay back interest. So that is where we have interest payments going to. Government has borrowed and it is paying interest. Okay, note we have total government expenditures in 2009 here, and we also have federal government expenditures, but that is because you have the United States, which comprises states, federal states, and also central government. That's why we talk about a federal government, which is essentially the central government in the United States, and then obviously why we also talk about total government, which comprises of the central government and state governments. But note the principle is the same. The expenditures might be a little bit different. They might have different names, but the idea is very much the same. And the main expenditures, therefore, are transfers to those groups that need support, and also purchases of goods and services by government. And obviously, they will differ at federal level and state level. And the reason why they will differ is because we are essentially dealing with governments that have different functions. So a federal government will have different functions from that of state governments. So for example, the federal government, so that in the US is the central government. They will, for example, be paying for defense purchases. They will be purchasing defense equipment. They will be providing national defense, right? So we're talking about national level. There are also some federal or countrywide social security programs. Okay, so that is in panel B, right? Again, the emphasis is that the federal government spends differently than state governments do. And when we roll federal government and state governments into total government expenditure, in panel A, what we see is that the pie chart differs a little bit. Okay, and that is why, and the reason why is because state governments spend differently from federal governments. So for example, state governments might be responsible for the provision of education, okay? Something that will not be seen to the same extent by federal government. Okay, so that is why we have that difference. But nevertheless, the idea is this. Yes, that governments do spend, whether they be state or whether it be a central government, the expenditures might differ. They might spend on different things. But nevertheless, the idea is very much the same. They engage in transfer payments, they engage in purchases of goods and services, and also they pay interest and they pay subsidies. And those transfer payments comprise of different forms of aid and so on, whereas purchases comprise of purchases of different goods and services. So relatedly, over a few earlier slides, one of the earlier slides dealt with how do we measure the size of the public sector or the size of government. And one way of measuring the size of public government was to look at how many employees is government employing. Well, another way to look at it is what is the level of public expenditure over gross domestic product, over total gross domestic product as a percentage. So a bit of recap is, what is the gross domestic product? Well, the gross domestic product is the value of goods and services produced in a given country over a given period of time, let's say a year. Now, that value of goods and services comprises of number one, private production, and number two, public production. And how we can measure the size of the public sector is by looking at what is the fraction of public expenditure by government as a fraction or as a percentage of GDP. So in this instance, we see that black line. Okay, so that is government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. What you see is, again, around the World War II period, we have that spike. Why? Because government is paying for the war effort. So hence we have the spike in government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. But over time, what we have is apparently a growing public sector. In other words, government expenditure as a fraction of GDP is increasing. Okay, so that is what we see here. Other points are the Reagan years. Also, the war in Iraq, which happened, would have happened around 2003, so somewhere here. And also the conflict in Afghanistan, also around 2003 and thereafter. Now, the reason why wars are such good examples of increasing government expenditure is because wars are very costly to fight. Military equipment costs. So I guess that is why it makes sense to point these periods out where we suddenly have a jump in total government expenditure as a fraction of GDP. Okay, so two examples here are around World War II, around 1945 and just before, and also around 2003, because the United States was involved in conflicts at that period in time. So hence, government expenditure went up. Okay, remember, it's government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So we don't just look at government expenditure, we look at it as a percentage of GDP, total GDP. Another measure is to look at what is the percentage of government transfers, interest payments as a matter of, or as a fraction of total government expenditure. So again, if government is making a great amount of transfer payments, paying more interest, what this implies is it's supporting more people. So for example, in South Africa, the South African government provides grants to 17 million people, but the population is about 60 million. So obviously that is a massive amount. And what will happen then? That means that government expenditure has risen in order to support those 17 million people. So what you will essentially see is government transfers and interest payments rising as a total of government expenditure. So what is one form of government transfer? Well, it is social insurance. And this is exactly what you see here happening over time. What you're seeing is social insurance as a percentage of total expenditure rising from about 10% in the 1950s to about 26% in 2005. So again, it appears by this measure, what's happening is that we have the public sector rising, or the public sector size increasing. Okay, this would obviously also be reflected as an increase in total expenditure as a fraction of GDP, total government expenditure as a fraction of GDP. Why? Because that is social security and government transfers are also part of government expenditure. except services not being rendered in this instance, unlike expenditure on military equipment where services and goods are provided in return for expenditures by government. But nevertheless, this still can be seen as a measure of the size of government. One point that needs to be mentioned, that what you may also see is interest payments rising. Not always, but that is something that may also happen. In this instance, what we have is we have net interest payments falling. So we have interest payments falling. Now, how is it the government can fund its expenditure? Well, it can fund its expenditure by, number one, taxation, but also by borrowing. If it borrows, what will happen is that interest will grow, or should, in theory, grow. Obviously, a number of other things can happen, okay, so that net interest doesn't grow. In other words, a country can borrow to other countries, lend to other countries, sorry, and as a result of that, a country can receive interest payments from the countries it's lent to, and hence net payments may fall. But nevertheless, one sign of a rising or an increase in the size of the public sector may also be related to increasing expenditures, to increasing interest payments. So what is it that we see here? Well, what we see is here is a comparison of expenditures across countries. So for example, let's start with Sweden. Now, why Sweden? Well, Sweden tends to have more of a socialist orientation. So hence it will have some specific characteristics. Well, first of all, government expenditures is high. It's almost 54% of GDP. Now, what does that comprise of? Well, first of all, what we have is we have a large amount being spent on social benefits. Then what we have is some expenditure of goods and services, and then what we have is expenditure on employee compensation. Compare that to the United States. The United States spends less as a fraction of GDP on government expenditure. So what is it that we have here? Well, first of all, what we have is we have social benefits, which do appear to be somewhat lower. We also have somewhat, not completely lower, but somewhat lower relative to that of Sweden. Then what we have is we have expenditure on goods and services, which also appears to be a little bit lower in terms of percentages. But remember that the United States has a much higher GDP. So in absolute terms, it might be spending a lot more than Sweden is. Okay? It's only as a fraction it appears to be less. And then also what we have is a lower fraction of expenditure as a percentage of total GDP going to employee compensation. Okay, so it would appear that in percentage terms, the United States has a smaller government. But remember, because the United States is far wealthier or far bigger, sorry, maybe not wealthier as GDP per capita, but far bigger than Sweden, what this means that in absolute terms, it will be spending more on employee compensation, goods and services, social benefits, and the others. Okay, note, so it is also dependent upon population. But what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to have a comparison. So we need to standardize across countries. And the way we do this is by using percentages. And that is what we are seeing here. So we are able to compare across percentage terms, on the basis of percentage terms, as to which countries have the smallest governments or the smallest public sector and the largest public sectors. So what are countries spending money on? Well, the US has a large amount of US expenditure goes to defense. So that is what we immediately see. A lot more than Austria and a bit more than South Korea. Okay, so these are percentages of government expenditure. So the US is spending around, let's say, 11-12% on defense. Okay, so defense expenditure plays a large part for the United States. On the other hand, if you look at Germany, well, where is Germany spending its money? Where's government spending its money? It is spending its money on social protection. So that is what we see here. Okay, so the German government is spending a lot of its revenues on providing social protection. And if you look at Australia, for example, it appears that Australia is spending a significant chunk of its government expenditure on education. And so on for the different countries. And the reason why these countries tend to have different spending priorities is because of politics, their geographical location, and so on. So for example, European countries are not as much as under threat as the United States, which is a superpower. So hence there's a higher chance that the United States might fall under some form of attack from a certain quarter of the world, and as a result of that, it needs to be prepared, better prepared than countries that are less threatened by their neighbors or less threatened globally. So hence, what this means is that countries tend to spend differently and have different spending priorities. A lot of countries which had just attained their freedom, for example, that have become democratic, tend to spend a lot more on education. The idea why is to build up a middle economic class so that they can maintain political stability. So again, that is a changing priority, a different priority from, let's say, the United States, or a country that's constantly under threat by its neighbors. So the next question is, how does government make money? Well, there's a number of sources of income for government. First of all, what we have is we have individual income, and individual income comes as taxation from your salary. So you earn a salary, and part of that is then paid in tax. Let's say 20%. Then what you have is you have payroll tax. Now, this depends from country to country. Not all countries have payroll taxes, but the idea is that in this instance, you receive a specific salary, but part of that salary is paid as tax by the company or the organization that is paying you. So it's not a matter of you receiving a salary and then tax being taken off. It's a company that pays tax and then they pay your salary, which can also then be taxed. And that would be income tax in the second instance. Okay, so payroll taxes are before your salary is paid out, there's a tax that comes off it. Then what we have corporate income tax. So these are just simply companies that are paying taxes. Then what we have value added tax, or excise tax as it's called in the United States. So a percentage of every good that you purchased, while you pay tax on that every time you make a purchase. And then what you have is you have also customs tax. So when you import something, you pay tax on those imports. So that is another form of revenue that the government will receive then. And the government obviously receives quite a bit on this because we are always importing in the modern world. So whenever we import something specific, well, something or often selected goods, what will happen is that the government will tax those imports. We will pay a tax on top of the price. Quick overview of what are the sources of revenues for government, the source of taxation in the United States. Well, first of all, what we have is personal income tax. That appears to almost contribute 45% to government revenues in total. We also have social insurance contributions. So these come out of the so-called payroll taxes. This as a source of revenue has been rising, going from about under 5% to around also now 40% of government revenues. Corporate income taxes have been falling, so companies appear to be paying less taxes in absolute terms as a total of revenues. And then also what we see is customs and excise taxes falling. In other words, less money is now being charged in terms of custom duties, or a lower fraction of income comes from customs and excise tax. And this is potentially attributable to greater liberalization and trade treaties are signed between countries, where there's an agreement that goods sold by a specific country will not be subject to a customs tax. A note on corporate taxes. So what might be corporate income taxes falling? Well, one reason is to promote companies or encourage companies to come to specific countries to do business. So what they will do is they will move to a specific country that offers a favorable tax regime and begin operating there because they have to pay less taxes. Obviously, there is an argument as to whether this sort of situation is fair or not. So should corporates not be taxed more relative to individuals? But that is yet another part of the story. That is another debate, but it's something to be aware of, that often people say that corporates are not being taxed enough, whereas individuals are being taxed too much. So perhaps something to think about. Now, of course, sources of taxation or sources of government revenues as a percentage of GDP differ across countries. So, for example, if you look at let's say the United States, a significant proportion comes from income and profits, so around 10%, whereas social contributions are a smaller percentage, so somewhere there. And then also what you have is goods and excise, goods and services taxes. So for example, VAT, that is yet a smaller fraction. On the other hand, if you look at a country like Turkey, a large proportion appears to come from value-added tax, far less from income, profits and capital gains taxes, and quite a bit more in percentage terms from social contributions, let's say. Sorry, some social contributions are here. So let me quickly just delete that. So again, this is potentially dependent upon the political and ideological orientation of a country. And I also want you to remember that we are talking about percentages. Because we are dealing with the US, obviously the amount of taxes in dollars will be far greater. That is, the amount of taxes that will be raised from income taxes will be far greater than for Turkey, although the proportions do differ nevertheless. So something to be mindful of. What we need to touch on is this idea of a deficit. So what exactly is a deficit? A deficit occurs when government spends more than it earns. And the way we finance a deficit is by borrowing. Now, obviously, when a government is borrowing, it is incurring debt. So government can have debt, and that debt will be related to the deficit. So as you can see here, what we've had is around 1945, around the World War II period. Again, the United States, we had a budget deficit. So government was spending far more in terms of funds in terms of its revenues that it was receiving. Obviously, that dropped after World War II, so the government deficit decreased, and hence it rose slowly through time. There's a general upward trend, and then what also happens is then plummeted, and then it started rising immediately. So that is the sort of trend that we see. So what government needs to do is it needs to borrow, and to borrow, what it can do is it can borrow domestically by issuing bonds, or alternatively, it can borrow in international markets, and that is how it finances its deficit. So on the previous slide, we looked at the government deficit as a percentage of its expenditures. What happens if we look at debt in terms of dollar terms? Okay, well, what we see is that debt has been rising, right? So note debt as in terms of billions of US dollars, so that is what we see. That has been rising, but note GDP has also been rising, and so has government expenditure. That is why when we look at it in terms of percentage terms, it will look a little bit different than this graph here. So yes, in dollar terms, debt is far greater. But on the other hand, when we look at it in terms of percentage terms, we see a slightly different picture. And the reason why is because expenditure has been rising in dollar terms also, and so has GDP. So why could, for example, a deficit arise? Well, first of all, in order to fund a deficit, in order to fund government expenditure, we need to tax. But what happened under the Clinton administration? Well, what we saw is we saw tax cuts. And also that occurred just around or just before the conflicts in Iraq and also Afghanistan. So there were tax cuts, and then that was followed by a expensive military conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, this required government to increase its expenditure, and hence what we saw is we saw federal debt rise, and also, as on the previous slide, the deficits and borrowing would also rise as a result of these conflicts. Then what contributed further to this was the recession in 2009. Obviously, what happens in a recession is people lose jobs, so government is unable to receive as much revenue. And the reason why it's unable to receive as much revenue is because there are people out of work and they do not have money to pay taxes or pay as much tax and purchase as much goods and services. And remember that these goods and services are all taxed, so that would also go to receive of revenue. Okay, so tax cuts, unusual events, and also recessions are all that can contribute to a deficit and increased borrowing. And that is what we see on this slide and the previous slide. So finally here what we have is a comparison of government gross debt and deficits across countries, and what we can see is that, for example, Japan has a very large amount of debt, 216% to be precise, as a percentage of GDP, whereas the United States has a 84 or 85% gross debt as a percentage of GDP. On the other hand, upper middle income countries stand out. They have remarkably low deficits and debt figures. In terms of is debt bad or not, well, the recommendation is that governments should not take on too much debt. Why? Because high debt means high interest payments. High interest payments means less goods and less money to be spent by governments on goods and services in terms of providing these to its citizens, and more to be spent on interest repayments and the settling of debt. Nevertheless, the answer ultimately is it depends. If a country is able to borrow and spend money in such a way that increases tax revenues in the future, well, then there is a case to be made for taking on debt and running government deficit over a period of time. So yes, deficits might not be a good idea, nor might debt be a good idea. However, if it can be utilized effectively in order to expand the economy or invest in production, invest in the economy in the long run, then it potentially has a benefit in the long run. And that, dear students, brings us to the end of our lecture for today.